Hello, students. I wanted to talk to you now about the third reading for this week. It was a chapter called McLuhan Fiore, Massaging the Message. It comes from a remarkable book called Design Writing Research by Ellen Lupton and J. Abbott Miller. Abbott and Miller are a design power couple. Miller is an American graphic designer and writer and a partner at Pentagram. At Pentagram, he leads designing team identities, exhibitions, environmental graphics, books, magazines, and web and interactive projects. His wife, Ellen Lupton, is a graphic designer, writer, curator, and educator, best known for her study of typography. She is the curator of contemporary design at Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in New York City and is the director of the Graphic Design MFA program at Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA, in Baltimore. So this chapter comes from that remarkable 1999 book, and it's about this remarkable 1967 book, Marshall McLuhan, Quentin Fiore, The Medium is the Massage. So I have an original $1.45 paperback copy of this book. And in the article that you were to have read, there are several images from the book, and the authors talk about the relationship between the image and the text. And so I just want to point to a couple of the claims made by the authors about why this particular book is so significant. And part of its significance has to do with the fact that Marshall McLuhan was extremely famous and popular in the late 60s and early 70s, and then he fell sort of out of favor. Critics of Marshall McLuhan said, okay, he makes these grand pronouncements and he doesn't really back up his claims with data. And so there were social scientists who kind of, looked askance at Marshall McLuhan. He was working out of University of Toronto up in Canada, and his sort of credibility suffered until there was sort of a resurgence in McLuhan, starting as early probably as the 80s, early 90s, because many of the predictions that he made in the 60s, in the 50s, and the 60s actually seemed to come true in the 80s and the 90s. So now people are rereading Marshall McLuhan and saying, all right, he did not behave and he did not write in the way that typical academics write. But guess what? When it comes to his understanding of what was happening in society, particularly with respect to mass media and communication, he was somewhat of a seer. He foretold the future. So the article, the McLuhan-Fiore article, starts off by saying that a recent article on the critical reception of Marshall McLuhan's work summarily dismissed his 1967 The Medium is the Massage and 1968 War and Peace in the Global Village as crude publicity tracts. And so, indeed, although this book was extremely popular in its day, critics said it's not really a serious work. And the authors, Lupton and Miller, are arguing it was radical, and if it was not that influential, it's not because it was not a great book. It's because of how conservative the publishing industry is. So in their article, they repeatedly report to the idea that in the values of the publishing industry, a divide persists between words and pictures, high academia and low mass media, authors and designers. So this then points to something that we had mentioned before, that in certain areas, and the university is one, you've got this notion that words are the end-all and be-all, and pictures are, they can be cute, they can be decorative, and they're not very serious. And the more our culture changes, where we have a higher proportion of pictures and sort of lower incidence of words, the more desperate become those people who would defend the word in the face of this sort of onslaught of pictures. So much of the article talks about Quentin Fiore, who is actually sort of a mainstream successful graphic designer, particularly interested in typography, and how he and McLuhan joined forces to make this book. And unlike the usual situation where an author has a text and then what happens is someone is given a commission to come up with illustrations for the text, it was more like uh, Fiore and McLuhan agreed that several of McLuhan's ideas should be sort of spread throughout this book, and then how they're represented is something that was left up more to Fiore. So basically, the first image on the first page, it just has a picture. It says "Good morning." It's a picture of an egg, and then it has, I think it's, I can't read the letters, but the yolk on the egg has a label on it. You've then got this very strange and graphic photograph, and this is actually of, I believe it's a Japanese test pilot undergoing a certain number of gravitational force, certain number of G's, and the person's face is radically distorted. The picture on the front of the book itself, it looks like it's a sort of a distorted image of a woman's face. And what happens is, if you turn the book so that you're seeing it sort of on an angle, the distortion is resolved. So there's an interesting graphic effect on the cover of the book. And so the notion is that the medium is the massage, which is sort of a play on words on one of Marshall McLuhan's most famous phrases: the medium is the message. And so then you see a book like this. This is not the way books looked in 1967. And so you have things like, here is a large picture of a fingerprint. You go to the next page, and now that fingerprint is up here in miniature. So that's one of the things that the authors talk about is Fiore, the graphic designer, is using repetition in this book in a way that is actually a visual version of one of McLuhan's points about repetition, which is that in the age of mass production, what we have are so many material objects that are repeated. So then again, here's another one where you've got this picture on this side, and you turn the page, and now on the next page, the same picture is over here as a thumbnail. So this is a tactic that Fiore, the graphic designer, is employing in this book as a way to visually represent some of McLuhan's concepts. This is one of the things that's mentioned in the article, that what you have is this page, and it's the book, and you have a pair of thumbs holding open the book. And if you are looking at the book, your thumbs are sitting on top of the thumbs that are on the pages of the book. It says the book is an extension of the eye. So McLuhan is making grand philosophical pronouncements that his critics will say, oh, that's all well and good, but you don't really have any evidence to support it. Fiore is providing the visual analog of those pronouncements, and we end up with something that the authors of the article say it's part book, it's part magazine, it's part storyboard. This one here is one of my favorite illustrations. You're in a car and you're looking at the rearview mirror, and in the rearview mirror is a sort of Pony Express, Wells Fargo type of covered wagon. And it says, the past went that away. When faced with a totally new situation, we tend always to attach ourselves to the objects, to the flavor of the most recent past. We look at the present through a rear view mirror. We march backwards into the future. Suburbia lives imaginatively in bonanza land. So these are the kind of aphoristic utterances that Marshall McLuhan was very fond of producing. And these are the kind of things that drove sort of more serious academic critics crazy. And what we have then is a book which is not just providing the author or the audience with some of McLuhan's ideas, which is one of the things they do, because previous to this, much of McLuhan's work would be things that would be read in universities by people in communications departments and not written experience in the mainstream. Whereas this was the largest selling book of Marshall McLuhan's life. It sold over 1 million copies. It was translated into many different languages, and that sort of bothered McLuhan because it was not quite as serious as some of his other projects. Okay, so I'm going to read from the last 2 paragraphs of the essay. The ability to create meaning by recycling, repeating, and reframing images and text constitutes Fiore's graphic response to McLuhan's assessments of the cultural impact of communication and technology. This McLuhan-esque design strategy informed Fiore's work with Rubin and Fuller as well, appropriately, since these authors, too, were concerned with the reproduction of social life, from Fuller's celebration of liberating technology to Rubin's critique of oppressive institutions. Final paragraph reads, Fiore finds irony in the fact that his 50-year career is measured by work he produced at the margins of publishing during a span of 2.5 years. In retrospect, the late 1960s have emerged as a period of reevaluation and reinvention in American history, an era whose momentous wave of cultural change carried design along with it. Like the 1920s, the 60s witnessed international upheaval in art and politics, in sexuality and social transgression, and in the theory and practice of media. Fiore's books collapse together the roles of author, editor, designer, and producer. The fact that this strategy has been so rarely repeated says more about the conservatism of the, quote, industry of the word, unquote, than about the success of the projects. The enthusiastic merging of theory and populism, words and pictures forged by Fiore and his collaborators, delivers a formidable challenge and an inspiring model to contemporary graphic designers who are working to rethink the normative boundaries of professional practice. So I had mentioned in the page introducing these readings that I'm going to ask you to give some thought now to the magazines and the mass media that you are familiar with, the print mass media that you're familiar with, and then think about that chapter, which was a chapter on design and layout and graphics, which is sort of a very conservative, traditional approach to how you produce print publication. And then think about this sort of very radical 1967 hippie, wild, crazy philosophical argument about mass media, and say whether you think this book has had a big effect or not. Because Lupton and Miller seem to say it's surprising how little its effect has been because of how radical and transgressive the ideas are, and they attribute the little effect to the conservatism of the publishing industry. But now again, Lupton and Miller were writing in 1999. We've got 19 years since then, and it's quite possible that just as McLuhan was successful at predicting certain future impacts and consequences in mass media, it's possible that some of the mass media that you might be familiar with are starting to show some influence of this McLuhan-esque Fiore design principles. So I'm going to save this now and post it to our Canvas site. And maybe tomorrow what I might do is put up a discussion question asking you to respond to this notion of whether the traditional old school design principles are still really dominant, or some of this, what was radical new ideas in 1967, are really starting to show up in publications that you are familiar with.